I wouldn't say that this one was a total failure by any means. I think that Sarah Palin did bring unity to the Republican base, and that helped McCain a lot, but then somebody else had to bring in these people, these independents. And I think the calculus of the campaign was that John McCain would do that. And apparently he was unable to do that. In fact, in some ways, the Palin nomination got in the way of his ability to reach out to those folks. And I think Joe's point about not having a consistent story was really part of the problem here. If John McCain was going to nominate someone like Sarah Palin, then he had to have a story that fit with her ability. And in many respects, Governor Palin was misused in this campaign. She was set up to do things that she wasn't very well equipped to do. From that perspective, one might argue that she performed rather well. But the expectations that were set by the way the campaign used her were just too high for her to meet. For instance, if they were going to use her in the way as a complete maverick, then they should have found another way to use her instead of the traditional attack dog role of the vice president. That's a time-honored way. Joe Biden fulfilled that role on the Democratic side. But if you're picking someone who's completely different, then you've got to have a completely different strategy. So it seems to me like the brain trust in the McCain campaign had a really interesting idea with Sarah Palin, but they simply couldn't follow through with it. So it ended up being a big problem for them.
Gentlemen, thank you for your insights. I thought, why should I come today? Now I know. You really have illuminated the election for us. But there's one group that I haven't really heard you talk about specifically. On election eve, I sat in my daughter and son-in-law's house with various neighbors, children's from 11 to 15 years of age. They knew the states that you should look for to win. They knew what was going on. They had been involved in this campaign. They had been knocking on doors, etc. Now, I think that we need to also credit the children, the students that could vote in this election. Could you illuminate that and tell us what role they really played from start to finish to help Obama win?
Well, Senator Obama, this is John Green, Senator Obama certainly had a great deal of appeal to young people. I think his idealism and his ability to explain the goals he had for the country resonated particularly strongly with young people. And as you point out, not just people who were young voters, but people who were a little bit younger than that. That's actually historically not all that unusual. One of the first elections that I followed closely as an analyst and as a young college professor was the 1980 election with Ronald Reagan. And I was really amazed that my young students really liked Ronald Reagan because in many ways he was inspiring, and not exactly the same way as Senator Obama, but younger people, maybe all of us have some capacity to be inspired, but young people particularly have a capacity to be inspired. I think if you look at the exit polls, and maybe Fritz can talk a little bit about his polling, we see that in many parts of the country, younger voters voted decisively for Obama. And in other places, maybe a little bit less so, but in key places they did. But it's not just what happened at the ballot box. It was the activist core. Now, part of that was the money that Obama had to hire people, but part of it was the enthusiasm he got among young people who would go and work on this campaign in far-flung places. Again, that's not entirely new, but it was a really very important factor in this campaign. Fritz, do you want to comment on the polling?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The ability to get young voters involved using the internet was critical. The Facebook organization, the email campaigns to bring them together. The problem with young people in the past has always been that they'd get excited, but they had no outlet for that excitement. Mm-hmm. Well, with the internet, you could get them organized, you could assign them tasks to do, to accomplish, that went beyond your typical phone banking and whatnot. They were knocking on doors, and they were really active, and they were able to travel and be active because the Obama campaign could afford to pay for some of that movement of people to key states. But I don't think you can underestimate the value of this elongated election day. This early voting phenomenon was tremendous because, again, that gave them something to do that was meaningful over a longer period of time. getting people organized, and then in that last month here in Ohio and in many other states, getting them to help people get to the polls, especially these new people who had registered with the Obama campaign at the website or whatever, and just to have so much opportunity to actually vote and get so many of these new people. It used to be they had one chance to vote on election day, and most of these younger people were busy. You know, they just one day, that's all I got, and they forget, and they go on doing things. But if you have a whole month, you can forget for 29 days and still succeed.
Or you can vote and then forget about it.
Well, yeah.
Well, as the Obama campaign urged people to do, vote and then try to bring other people to the polls.
Yeah, and again, what we found in our polling was amazing, the support, the lead that Obama was able to bank in so many states with these early voters, most of them younger people.
Joe?
This question is specifically for the man from the plain dealer, but feel free to give any insight, all three of you. Charges of media bias are as old as elections themselves, but for the first time we really saw an escalation of unforgiving media bias, and I mean specifically Fox News versus MSNBC really unforgivingly going for one side or the other. What effect do you think this new trend had on the election this year, and where do you see it going in the future?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I think you were talking about, these are news organizations or cable networks that are basically used as part of their marketing. We're the Democratic place, we're the Republican place, and this is something that's been escalating at least since the 1980 campaign, where I've noticed more and more people who like to live in an echo chamber. They read conservative or liberal blogs. They read conservative or liberal columnists. They watch, their individual networks. They watch they listen to their radio shows, and I think it's bad for the country as a whole, because I think it feeds into this excessive partisanship and this idea that only my side's right, because part of the shtick, if you're watching Fox or if you're watching MSNBC or you're listening to Rush or you're listening to Rachel Maddow, is the other guys are absolutely wrong on everything, and my side's absolutely right about everything. Again, I think that's really unhealthy for America, and particularly if you believe that most Americans would traditionally like to live in the center and to sort of distill what they hear from one side and the other and maybe come up with a synthesis. I think it's very difficult. And in terms of the other media bias had to do with, I think, running against news, particularly more mainstream news organizations, which to me that's kind of an old one. The Republican Party in particular has going back into 40, 50 years, has always been running against the New York Times or whomever. I grew up in Illinois. The Democrats, swore at and swore about the Chicago Tribune, in particular its editorial page, through on any issue you could imagine. So there's something like maybe that little echo chamber's been going on. But I do think we have this problem now of, because of how you can customize where you get your news from in some ways, people only want to hear their side. And when you really feel it on a newspaper, is people calling you, you ran this column. Well, yes, we ran Maureen Dowd, but we also then ran George Will, but you don't remember, because maybe you don't read George Will, so you think there are, it's only liberals in the paper. It really drives you crazy in terms of trying to figure out, again, if you're trying to sort of be balanced, and there is such a thing as fair and balanced, it doesn't have to be a slogan. It actually ought to be sort of your watchword if you're in what people call the mainstream media, but it's getting harder and harder all the time.
Fritz, what did the public think? Did the public perceive bias in news coverage?
Well, we saw that in our polling. We have a standard series of questions we ask people about their news consumption and whether they believe that there is a bias. And to a small degree, it increased, but it was always there. There is a small majority who believe that there is a media bias.